So one of the best leadership lessons I ever learned, and it's a lesson we tell a lot of our new leaders, it happened to me years and years ago. And it helps, I think, describe to leaders, owners of businesses, exactly what really good leadership looks like and what bad leadership looks like. So a boss of mine, he was the group chairman of the group. I'd just been promoted, and honestly, I don't think I was quite ready for the role. No, I definitely wasn't ready for the role. It was way too big for me. But anyway, I determined to make a handsome fist of it, and it was very political. It's a long story. Anyway, they gave me the job. And I was the youngest general manager in the history of the organization. It was a top 60 PLC. It's a big role. And I got to my desk on day 2, I think, and there was a note from my boss. This is I'm ancient, so this was a long time before email, and the note just basically said, when you get in this morning, come and see me. And I thought, okay, the gig's up, right? I thought he realizes he's made a terrible mistake after only 24 hours, and he was going to give me my marching orders. Anyway, so I walked into his cavernous office, and he bade me sat down in front of him, and straight out of the block he said, have you ever worked for a terrible leader? So as I tell you the story, I'm hoping that maybe some of the viewers and listeners are going to think about a time when they had a terrible boss, terrible leader. I think most people have had in some way. Anyway, I said yes, of course I had, making sure that he understood that he wasn't one of them. And he said, okay, great. And he leaned across behind him, and he grabbed a piece of paper out of a printer, and he went into his jacket and got a pen, and he put it on top of the paper and slid it across this vast desk. And he said, would you write down what that terrible, dreadful leader was? Write down characteristics of this terrible boss. Now, I can't remember exactly what I wrote down, but I think everybody listening can imagine. I think I wrote down something like micromanagers, place favorites, inconsistent, anything that you can imagine that a terrible boss might be. So I wrote down 3 or 4 things. Wasn't sure where this whole exercise was going. Put the pen back on, put the top back on the pen and slid it back. And he very carefully studied the list, nodded sagely, and he said, give me a few more, and slid the piece of paper back. So then I wrote some other things of a terrible leader. I wrote maybe tactical, not strategic, absent, difficult to connect with, poor communicate, all of the stuff that everybody knows, right? Put the top back on the pen, slid it back to him. Very carefully and wisely and sagely looked at the list, turned the piece of paper around, slid it back, and he said, just give me a few more. Okay, took the top off the pen and wrote down a few more. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I had maybe 10 or 12 things at the end of the exercise. This is like leadership dreadful manifesto, right? This is what terrible leadership looks like. Put the top back on the pen, slid it back across the desk, and he took the piece of paper and sat back in his chair, and he looked at it and he went, that's a very good list. So thanks very much. And then he said, will you do me an enormous favor? I said, yeah, of course. What do you need? And he gave me the list back, and he said, whilst ever you're working at this organization, can you promise me you'll never do any of the things on this list? And I thought, what a great way to illustrate, to kind of make very real and visceral how not to act, how not to behave. And the inference is do everything that's the opposite of everything on this list. So I was quite taken aback, and I said, yeah, of course. Yeah, okay, I'll do my best. He said, all right, terrific. And he said, will you do me another favor? I said, yeah. He said, will you fold that list up and put it in your pocket and carry it with you at all times? I thought, this is now getting slightly bizarre. I said, okay, yeah. And he said, and whenever I meet you in a corridor or pass by you or whatever, He said, have your list to hand, and maybe we'll talk about it. I said, yeah, okay, let's do that then. Terrific, he said, see you later. Right? And with that, that was the end of the meeting. But I did fold it up and I did put it in my pocket and I did think about it a lot. And I did talk about it when I saw him. And I did often think, well, how should I respond to this query? How should I respond to this question? This is a tricky one. What's the right response to this? And I often thought about the list that was in my pocket and thought, well, I know what to not do. Let's do the opposite of that. Anyway, about 2 months after that, that's not the end of the story. In and of itself, that would be a good story. About 2 months after that, there had been a full 360 employee engagement survey performed before I kind of got this slightly lofty position. And the results had come out. We'd spent a lot of money. I can't even tell you how much money. I'm embarrassed. A lot of money, but there were about 17,000 people that worked at the business. And the employee engagement survey came out, and it was like that. It was like the New York Yellow Pages. That's how old I am. And if you dropped it on your foot, you'd have broken a toe. But there was an executive summary that was maybe 25 or 30 pages long. And I knew we had a board meeting pretty soon, so I thought, if I quickly skim through the executive summary, I'll get a general gist of what's going on. And it wasn't too favourable, right? The employees were complaining that they didn't trust the board and the board weren't communicating with them properly. And okay, so I quickly skimmed through that and raced to the board meeting. Got to the board meeting, sat down, and everyone was looking slightly nervously because they'd done what I had just done, which was just read the executive summary. And anyway, the boss came in and he sat down at the table and he said, has anybody read the report? Now, clearly we hadn't read the full report because it had only just come out. But a couple of us had scanned the highlights of the summary. So I was feeling quite smug, actually, because I knew it had nothing to do with me, because the results, all of this was done before I had joined. Or rather before I had the position. Anyway, so he said, okay, what do we think? What do we think about the results, the report? And everybody kind of went, fair enough. And he said, do you know what the problem is? He said, we've all been doing the things that are on our list. Everybody get your list out. And all of the directors, they all had a similar list. They had their own list. But it was like I got my list out and I thought I was the only one that had the list. But everybody had their list. And it was terrific because everyone was like, yeah, we have done a bit of this. And yeah, we have done a bit of that. And we haven't done enough of this. And I thought, what a great lesson. Here's what then happened. It gets better. He then asked us all to stand up. And he said, cup your hands as if you were holding some water in your hands. Imagine how you've got to hold that water in your hands. You'd have to really pay attention to it. And you'd have to hold it really tight. You'd have to focus on it. I said, now imagine if you had that water in your hands and you had to walk from here to the other side of the room. How would you walk? Everybody said slowly and intentionally, with intention and diligently and carefully. And he said, yeah, that's exactly right. And he said, and if I asked you to not let anything drip, how much attention would you have to pay for it and to it? And everybody said you would have to pay an enormous amount of attention to it. He then said, what would happen if you did that? And everybody said, well, of course, all the water would fall out of our hands and onto the floor. And then he said, and if I asked you to then pick up the water off the floor again and put it back into your hands, how difficult would that be? And everybody agreed that that would be impossible to do. And he said, well, instead of thinking of it as water in your hands, that's the trust in which our people, that's how carefully we have to manage the trust that people place in our hands. And if we don't pay great attention to it and it starts to drip out and we even do that, we'll never get it back. Because the good that we do is written in sand and the bad that we ever do is written in marble. And we've done that, guys. So let's fix it. And of course he was right. And I think I've told that story hundreds of times maybe to lots of leaders who have found themselves in a position where maybe they've let their people down. So I think, what does good leadership look like? well, we know what bad leadership looks like. Let's just go the other way. And I think for me, that was one of my best, most powerful, fortunately, one of my earliest lessons. And I've kept that with me for all of these years. I think we mention it in the book. I'm pretty sure that we do. So that's what good leadership looks like, I think.